Broadcasting from the business capital of the world, this is the Podcast Business News Network.
And when you get right down to it, everything that governs our world and us comes down to ethics. Everything, even your personal choices. There is moral, there are ethics involved in that. This gentleman has taught that as a professor for many years. We're talking about business ethics as well as researched it deeply. And we are going to take a look at some things trending in the news recently that involve ethics, and a fascinating look with this guy. Ronald Berenbeim joins us back again on the program. Welcome back. How are you?
Hi, Steve. How you doing?
I'm
Okay?
well. Yeah,
All
doing
right.
okay. And when we last got together, we were talking about Claudine Gay as the Harvard president. She resigned due to some situations surrounding her and her background. And I guess we should recap. Why don't we do that and then move forward? Because this whole situation, ethically involved, has radically changed in the last couple of weeks, hasn't it?
Well, yes and no. What has happened is that each of the individual elements in it have now metastasized into issues on their own. But the primary issue we discussed then was her appointment at Harvard, how she conducted herself, whether they should have appointed her in the first place, how they handled it when some opposition that could have been predicted arose, and how they handled it, how they handled that opposition. And the most basic way in which they handled it, as we know, is that she has now resigned. Okay, so I thought, well, time to move on. You know, Boeing planes are developing problems left and right. There's so many new issues. But then I found that I could run, but I couldn't hide, that this is still, even the Boeing defense in one case was that they'd hired too many women who didn't know enough about planes. So here we are with DEI again. And so I think last week was not the beginning of the end of DEI, but as Churchill once said, the end of the beginning. And let's go forward for them. The main thing it did, besides costing Claudine Gay her job and embarrassing the trustees and the institution, which would be enough, but it gave DEI opponents an opportunity to go on the warpath. And two of the key antagonists were Harvard graduates, members of the Harvard community. One is Elise Stefanik, whom I had referred to as Alyssa Slotnick, different people. It's Elise Stefanik. Elise Stefanik is now being mentioned as a possible running mate for Donald Trump, should he be nominated. And so she's a representative from the state of New York and in the House of Representatives. And then there is Bill Ackman, who is head of Pershing Square Investments, and he is now an active participant in the fray. And then there's a third, which is the Claremont Institute. Claremont Institute is well, but not recently known to me as a young reporter, which is how, in many ways, my career as it started. I was a reporter for the Claremont Courier. I knew a lot of those people. I knew the town, which is a delightful place if you've ever been there. But the most prominent celebrity I knew was a guy who had run for the House of Representatives in 1948 against a young congressman named Richard Nixon, had run for Congress against him and lost. And he used to have parties, and we all used to talk about, the good old days, at least for them, but not for me. I was just a child at the time. So DEA is an acronym for diversity, equity, and inclusion. How does DEI, you recall our basic frame, how does it improve, more perfect union, or mend, tikkun olam, mend the world, existing academic institutions? Who benefits? Are there costs? How are these costs covered? Could these resources be put to better or more efficient use to achieve the same objectives? Now, diversity, equity, inclusion. What are the objectives to these ends? Well, academic programs where history is no longer going to be just guns and boats, as they used to say in my day, but it's going to be about individual communities, some of them living to a greater or lesser degree apart from the major communities. We're not just going to talk about history of Western civilization, whatever that means. Gandhi once said, when he was asked about Western civilization, he said he thought it would be a good idea. Well, anyway, that was what education was about, certainly in my day, primarily. But we're also going to talk about uncovered, or to a greater or lesser degree, ignored communities like Indigenous Americans, African Americans, women, and so on. And we're going to do so in 4 different ways. We're going to have academic programs. We're going to have programs that teach African American history, for example. We're going to sort of try to tinker with the student body composition with various different alternative ways of gaining admission to these institutions. We're going to hire faculty that belong to these various different groups or have done scholarship in those areas. And top management and trustees will also be represented in this population.
You know, in face value with Claudine Gay, be it she's an African American woman, a lot of things were in place. It seemed, again, just looking at this with flying over the bleachers, it would seem that it was a reasonable choice to put her in there as president. Do you feel the same way?
Yes, I do. In spite of, you will remember that I would not have picked her had I been on the board of trustees for reasons I elaborated at that time.
Mm-hmm.
But certainly she ticked all the boxes. I wouldn't exactly call her an African American, but she came from Haiti. She was a Black person.
Mm-hmm.
And her scholarship, such as it was done in that area and African American studies. And she had something else that a lot of highly qualified people that meet both of those requirements did not have. She had considerable management experience in diversity, equity, and inclusion programs. And I did a little bit of studying, and I found, for example, that at least one institution, the DEI program cost overall about $30 million in salaries and benefits for over 100 employees, that it had 17 employees who were paid more than $200,000 a year, which is more than a professor at a very advanced stage in his or her career, and that the chief executive officer of that program was paid nearly $400,000. So you see what kind of money is being poured in to the management and support for these kinds of programs. And I think that is one of the major issues that has to be dealt with here. Now, you recall the analytic frame that we had, where we want to look at first of all, divides into two categories. One is improvement. How can we make this a more perfect union? And as the Constitution reads, and there are three different ways of doing that, or broad schools of thought. Utilitarianism, started by Jeremy Bentham, the greatest good for the greatest number. But there are problems with this, not just in the case of DEI, but with any program. The problem is so-called externalities, hard to achieve perfect equilibrium. You are reshuffling the deck so that what happens is maybe you're dealing the people who've had a bad hand a better one, but are you doing so at the expense of other people who do not have a very good hand? And so that has certainly raised questions. And then the second is law. Now, law gives you an exit ramp, so to speak. You can say to people who say, well, you have to do this, you can say, well, we would have to fight that out in the courts. It would cost a tremendous amount of money. There are a lot of people on our board who say that there are legal problems involved. So it gives you an exit ramp, but it also gives that ramp to people who want to attack you and say that you are breaking the law. This is so-called reverse discrimination, or whatever you want to call it. And the third category is virtue, personal virtue, and that is, what is the virtuous thing for me to do if I'm Claudine Gay or Penny Pritzker, who was chairman of the Harvard board at the time. And then there's, and that comes to us from Aristotle. Then there's institutional virtue, designing institutions that enable and encourage and incentivize people to be more virtuous. And that was Aristotle's student, Plato. So, first of all, then we start talking about how you use these and to design a DEI program, which you inevitably do, for better or worse, and how you evaluate the efficacy of that program, and how best to use those strengths to accommodate the various constituencies within the universities who, have fundamentally different views and interests. The trustees, one thing, they want to raise money. The funders, they want to see their programs and their university reflect their wishes. The academy, which wants to see unexamined questions examined, and the students who want, to share their community with a diverse group of people, but they want to feel as though all of their colleagues and friends deserve to be admitted and deserve the same admission they got. And so what are the priorities for accommodating these fundamentally different views? Well, Harvard, for better or for worse, while Harvard was doing, at least in my view, with certain certain things that, at least in my personal view, it could have done better, differently, or not at all. Harvard was doing a pretty good job until Claudine came along. And then, for better or for worse, and I'm sure all of the trustees would vigorously deny this, they thought they could solve their problem with a single action, and that was to name a president who combined all of these things and who had experience, as very few, if any, academics had, in administering DEI programs, designing them, so on and so forth, and who had earned her chops, so to speak, in that particular area, which was even not, I would say, entirely recognized to this day
Well, Ronald,
as,
I want to ask you right at this point,
you know,
where do you think it went wrong? Was it the discovery of her, call it alleged plagiarism? Where did things derail? Because in the beginning here, we said that seemed like she was a reasonable candidate for Harvard president, but didn't work out that way. So what are your feelings that turned this into a negative story?
well, I think that at the beginning, from the very beginning, must have been trustees, and certainly within the community, of which I'm also a member, people had serious reservations uh, about her candidacy, even describing it in the best possible light. She wasn't, the kind of person we typically thought of uh, as a Harvard president.
Why is that?
And
Why
why
is
is
that?
it? Well, unlike her predecessor, she hadn't been president of another comparable, or almost no place is comparable, in my opinion, another comparable institution, as he was at, I think, Tufts.
Hmm.
She hadn't been a very well recognized scholar in key areas of history, as his predecessor was, and she just didn't fit into the mold. She wasn't, and even if you were back in the 1920s, when you had to have three last names to be president of Harvard,
Mm.
Abbott, Lawrence, and Lowell, uh, she wasn't that kind of a president either. So she was a radical departure, and though she had bona fides, I would have to say that they weren't any of the bona fides that had been traditional, which I guess is okay if you can accept the bona fides
Mm.
that constitute bona fides in that area. So then the plagiarism guys went to work, and they found one thing after another, and they found a rather slim record of scholarship anyway. No books,
Mm.
essays published in fairly obscure journals, and only 11 at that, over a long career, fairly long career. So they started to say, okay, even if she's everything you say, we'll concede that, you still have to deal with these issues. And that's when the board turned. First they picked her, then they stood behind her, then they dumped her.
I want to ask. I'm far from the expert. You're much more connected than the average person to Harvard. Your daughter is connected as well, not just as a student there. Um, how come? How did she get this far? We have these, what looks like a speed bump here, another speed bump here, another speed bump here, and she became the president. How did it even get that far?
well, first of all, she was a graduate of a number of had degrees from a number of important institutions. I recall one of them was Stanford. I don't remember for sure whether one of them was Harvard, but it probably was. And in that field, which was an infant field, if in fact it was a field at all, she had a vita, a record of publications, and most importantly, she had managed Harvard's program in this area for a number of years. So it seemed more like a promotion than a selection.
Hmm.
And she was, at the time of her selection, and I really can't figure this out, you'll have to ask somebody else about that, the dean of the College of Arts and Sciences, which would seem to be a logical spot from which to promote her.
Hmm.
So it looked like all systems go. We got to do this. Let's do it now. Let's do it with her and get it out of the way. And so I will just conclude with my remarks or my introduction with these observations. This is a conversation possibly without end as to how we're going to do this. My own feeling is that it's much more important to get entries into the mainstream than to, do this kind of freestanding administrative authority. For example, it's unthinkable now, so there has been some success, that we wouldn't have a survey course in American history without a considerable amount of it, none of which was the case in my day, devoted to African American history and to slavery. I suppose you might make an exception for the fact that once a year, the Brattle Cinema in Harvard Square would have a showing of Gone with the Wind, but that was about it. And then the freestanding element would evolve from that rather than possibly the other way around. That's one potential solution. But they did I think they did sort of get lazy on this one and take the easy way out. Her scholarship didn't start being attacked. It was just the legitimacy of that particular choice from that particular field of expertise and so on that was under attack. But if you wanted to pick, an African American woman to be the president of Harvard, one who comes immediately to mind, I'm not sure she would be interested, is Isabel Wilkerson, and you can see her biography in a film called Origin, which is opening at a theater near you now. So they did have other potential candidates they could have reached out to out of the university. And even if whether they had absolutely superior qualifications or not, they didn't have the disadvantage of having been from Harvard and just being kicked upstairs.
If you had
So
to, I'm just about out of time, but I'm curious. Scale of 1 to 10, in your opinion, Claudine, if she 10 being perfect candidate, checks all the boxes, did the background check, no plagiarism, things like that. 10, fantastic. Where would you put her as a candidate for this position?
maybe somewhere between 3 and 4.
Okay.
Because I don't, it may be just my prejudice, but I don't think this administrative experience is the key element. So if I just have close with one observation, I came to the conclusion that probably there has only been one entirely successful example of DEI that I can think of, and that is Noah's Ark. I mean, there was no discrimination. 2 of every single group imaginable admitted. There was equity. Everybody had a certain amount of space. There was no way of handling it any other way. And definitely there was inclusion. There was only one vote. And I don't know whether we'll ever have those ideal factors again, but that would be the ideal DEI example, in my opinion.
Well, interesting that you bring up that analogy. Noah, based on my accounts, had the experience to pilot that boat.
Yeah,
Otherwise, it wouldn't be there. Wow. Yeah. Fantastic talking with you today. Interesting insight and definitely a trending story that continues. Ronald, always great hearing your viewpoints on all of this. If somebody wants to reach out, certainly they can always reach us, instantfeedbacksteve@gmail.com. Your email address, are you open to sharing that if somebody wants to reach out directly to you?
Absolutely. It's ronald.berenbeim, BERENBEIM @gmail.com. And if you want to call me, I have a landline. That's what I use, 212-831-0645. And you cannot text me to that landline, okay?
Gotcha.
You have to call me and talk to me.
Yep, which is perfectly fine. I have my landline. I like it. I love it. I still use it. When my cell's not working, I'm on the landline. Thank you so much for being here today, Ronald. Looking forward next time we get together.
So am I. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Coming right back.
Are you looking for even more of the podcasts and hosts that you love? The Podcast Business News Network is proud to announce that you now have even more ways to listen live. Check out the MyTuner Radio, online radio box, and Simple Radio apps on iOS and Android, or find us online. Search for Business News Network on mytuner-radio.com, or search Podcast Business News Network on streama.com and onlineradiobox.com/US. Take your podcast on the go and don't miss a minute of the action.
Broadcasting from the business capital of the world, this is the Podcast Business News Network.
For nearly 2,000 severely injured veterans, everyday life has become filled with barriers.
Day-to-day simple tasks can become pretty daunting.
I have to carry my chair up 2 flights of steps or have somebody do it for me.
What scares me the most is just the falling.
When I'm struggling with my house, I think, to have that one great barrier just knocked down, it's crucial.
Home for Our Troops is a wonderful nonprofit that builds a
mortgage-free, fully adaptive, handicap-accessible house. And there's no catch.
It'll be our very first home that we've ever owned.
This is a game changer.
This is where your life begins again.
We need you to join us in completing this important mission. Please visit hfotusa.org and help build homes and rebuild lives.
Because of you, everything's going to be okay.